have Dr. Asma Gabriel from Nigeria, and we have Dr. Ali Abu Senna, the CEO of the Egyptian Environmental Affairs Agency. Dr. Ali would like to.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I would be very delighted to be with you today. And of course, the reduction of methane is something very important for us. I would like to highlight that Egypt launched its national strategy for climate change in 2002 until 2022, and we already did this strategy in more consultation with all stakeholders. It ended up with more than 127 projects related to adaptation and mitigations, with a lump sum of budget needed more than $300 billion, and half of them going for adaptation projects and mitigations for the other rest for the mitigation. So we aim that we by 2050 to achieve the target that we already put in this strategy. So working on the adaptation, it's a priority, as you say, a message from this COP27 that would like to go for global adaptation target, would like to work on the financing for the climate change action, would like to work more on the transparency of finance and also transfer of technology for implementation. So any initiatives related to enhance the implementation of as a climate action, it's fully supported. Egypt is hosting this COP27 on behalf of Africa. Although Egypt is only 0.5% contributing to the whole emissions of the world, but we are much affected by the climate change. We have a high vulnerability for the climate change, and we are in a situation that we have to start very strong immediately to implement our strategy. So the slogan of this conference is Together for Implementation. So together for implementation, I mean that also to consider how we can also take into consideration the needs of the developing countries. And as you can see, as a progress from this conference, that we put loss and damage at the agenda of the negotiation. This is something to find space to support the most vulnerable and affected countries by climate change. So for this, our session today, it's a really very important to look at alternative and of course the initiatives that could lead to the main target. And we are, as a Ministry of Environment, the Egyptian government, as we are the host country for the COP27, we endorsing and supporting any initiatives that could be bring all efforts together and end up with achieving the target that we would like all to achieve. So once again, thank you very much for inviting us for this, and I will leave the floor to Dr. Tarek to start moderation.
Shukran, Dr. Ali. Very pleased, Dr. Ali, to have you with us today. We will start with Claire. Without any further delay, I'm not going to present why we are interested in methane, why methane is not having the same importance as we are speaking about reduction of carbon dioxide, although methane has short-lived in the atmosphere, and it's easy to control. And it's one of the most important factors is methane has a higher potential warming than carbon dioxide. I will not get into the debate. Is it 80 times more or 100 times more? Depend on the lifespan. Is it 20 years or over 100 years? But at the end, if we succeeded to reduce the amount of methane, we may achieve our own goal to reach 1.5 increase. And if we succeeded to reduce the emission of methane, we can reach a reduction from the actual warming now, which we reach about 1.1 Celsius. By reducing methane and succession of the initiative, we can reduce down the emission or the warming by 0.3%, which is a large degree. So how do you find this from your own perspective and from own work as diplomacy and as from the team who formulated the methane reduction? How you can find it?
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, first of all, to Egypt for hosting COP27. I think one of the things that we have experienced from the US government side is just how important it is to have this COP in Africa to be focused on adaptation as well as mitigation. And so, just a note of appreciation to the Egyptian government for hosting us, and as well for having this important panel on the subject of methane emissions. So to start with, I think, and paint the picture a little on methane, one of the reasons that we believe methane emissions are so important is because the world has experienced so far 1.2 degrees of warming. It's 1.2 degrees too many, but that's where we are at in global warming today. 0.5 degrees of that warming comes from methane. And yet, in terms of a percentage of the conversation around climate change, methane is maybe 1%, 2%. And in terms of the finance, the percentage of climate finance going towards methane emissions, it's less than 2%. So there's clearly an imbalance between the importance of methane emissions in driving climate change and the amount of attention and finance that methane is receiving on the global stage. The US government, along with the EU, launched the Global Methane Pledge at COP26 in order to elevate methane in the global conversation and focus of climate change mitigation. The goal of the Global Methane Pledge is to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030, which is an absolute minimum if we are to keep 1.5 within reach and avoid many of the worst impacts of climate change. It's still a very difficult target to achieve because right now methane emissions globally are still increasing. And so the first thing that we need to do as a global community to implement the methane pledge in this COP of implementation is begin to stop the increase of methane emissions and turn the curve towards reductions. We've seen some really exciting progress already in the first year with the methane pledge, and I'll talk about three pieces in particular. The first piece is we have achieved this increased global attention on methane. We started with just over 100 countries in the pledge. Now we have 140 and still growing. So we've increased the global attention and focus in national methane action plans within countries to begin to address these emissions. The second thing is we have launched Energy Pathway, which we have worked on in part with the government of Egypt to focus on oil and gas emissions, which are those methane emissions which are most cost effective to address and where the technical solutions exist today. And so we have very significant steps that have been announced by President Biden just a few days ago and as well earlier this year to put additional resources and technical assistance towards reducing oil and gas emissions. And other steps on other sectors are coming later this week. And then the third piece is really beginning to increase the amount of climate finance that's going towards methane reduction. We're starting this with action in the US. So within the Inflation Reduction Act, there is $20 billion that is going towards methane abatement in the US. And that is very important in order to reduce US emissions, but it is so important for the world because that investment will begin to bring down the cost and grow an understanding of how to address methane emissions across every single sector. So that's some of the achievements we've had already on the methane pledge, and we're very excited by the attention to the growing attention to methane, and looking forward to continue working with everyone on the panel and in the room on increasing the focus on methane emissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, once more. And another question on the go, but just to think about it, during President Biden visit to Egypt, he offers that USA is going to support Egypt with 500 million USD for fugitive gases reduction, as well as stopping of the flaring of gas and oil, and how we can see this, how we can see the implementation of this thing. Okay, I will return back now to no, after I finish with Johnson, so you can think about the question and answer. And Johnson, after all of your experience in this field and your activity within different African countries, and also you got a paper on Egypt recently. So, how you visualize that? How you visualize what can be achieved? How you see the way forward in methane reduction out of your experience?
First of all, thank you for having me here, and thank you for putting together this panel, and thanks also. I echo my thanks to the Egyptian government for hosting us as well. For me, there's a number of steps in moving down this pathway to mitigating methane emissions. But it starts. The very first step is it starts with a willingness to engage and a desire from the host country to engage on this. We've seen that the first step is always creating what I call political will, having members of the government, high-level members of the government, in a space where they see this as a priority for the country moving forward. That creates the space for people like me to work with people in government or others to move forward on policy. Until we have that high-level political commitment to doing something, it makes it really difficult for any of us to move forward on policy. But once we get past that step, there's a huge amount of work and a huge amount of resources that are available to work with countries to move forward. In the case of Nigeria, and I don't want to steal everything that Asmal is going to talk about, but in the case of Nigeria, we worked with Nigeria for over 3 years, starting in the early stages, really just doing some capacity building workshops to for us to learn what the issues they were facing, and to work with staff and members of the government to develop, their vision to what they would like to do, and that the progress that we saw after that, led to improvements in inventory, improvements in possible policy solutions, and then finally actual policies being put in place. But it has to start with political will, and I think the Global Methane Pledge, the whole idea of the Global Methane Pledge was originally to give that political will, to create that place where leaders of governments could come together and say, you know what, this is really important, and we need to add our voices to this debate that elevates methane up below this 2% that Claire was talking about, that brings the attention that's necessary, because people who actually have to put together policies in governments don't often have that freedom to just say, all right, we're going to do a methane policy today, unless they've had leadership say, yeah, let's do a methane policy. So for me, that's probably the biggest thing.
Thank you so much for this comprehensive answer. And back to our colleague, Dr. Asma Gabriel from Nigeria. Nigeria is the first African country to set regulation for methane reduction. And actually, we would like you to shed some light on this and to share with us in Egypt what is the lesson learned, how we can go for such thing.
Thank you so much. Well, I would like to appreciate the organizers of this event. I think it's very important in helping to have awareness on reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. So, with that, yes, Nigeria made history as the first African nation to have guidelines on fugitive methane emission reduction, and this was approved just before we came to the COP, and the DPR, that's the Department of Petroleum Resources, um, launched it and announced it here at the COP that the guidelines are ready to be implemented. So we've been working with the DPR. Well, you hear me say DPR and NUPRC when we're working with the Department of Petroleum Resources at the beginning. There were Department of Petroleum Resources, but sometime earlier in the year, the name was changed to Nigeria Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission. So they're now NUPRC. So I'll be shuttling between the names. So we started the journey with the Clean Air Task Force and the CCAC that supported us uh, to develop the guidelines. And it was hosted by the DPR. And we had workshops with different stakeholders, even with the operators, to bring up information and on the development of the guidelines. So this was taken forward in 2020 with the best practice fugitive methane inventory using COMAT from the CATF, the Clean Air Task Force. And this was done with the DPR as well. So this was realized by collaboration between the Federal Ministry of Environment, where I belong, the Ministry of Petroleum Resources, with the DPR and the NNPC and the CCAC, UNEP, the Carbon Limits Nigeria, and of course the CATF. So some of the key outcomes are the raising awareness on fugitive methane emissions in the oil and gas sector. And we have also realized that technology is available to identify, measure, and quantify methane leaks also in the oil and gas sector. And the use of the COMAT software as well. And it served like a capacity building for the stakeholders involved. Also, the baseline assessment established using the COMAT helps the Department of Climate Change to intervene in getting the fugitive methane reduction targets set in the revised NDC. So in the revised NDC, Nigeria has set a 60% reduction, 60% target by the year 2031, 60% reduction of the methane emissions target by the year 2031. So the CATF supported the NUPRC, and that's the upstream, and also now the midstream and downstream in drafting the regulations. That's the guidelines for the fugitive methane emissions. And of course, I just said that it has been announced here at the COP that we have the methane guidelines, and we're working on the downstream and the midstream guidelines as well. So it is expected that the downstream will be ready also very soon. The midstream and the downstream guidelines will be already very soon. And our success, let me see, our success was hinged on the collaboration between all the stakeholders. So yes, and then bringing the stakeholders together helped us engage in the level of acceptance. That is, we even brought the operators of the oil and gas industry into this, and this has helped us to gauge their interest and their level of acceptance in this. So it is expected that in 2023, this the implementation will start, and then of course the enforcement of the use of the guidelines will also be in place. And that's maybe a year later, after the implementation starts, we'll be able to report back on the success of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Asma. I guess I'm just addressing your question to think about it before I'm going to my friend from Ghana, because I would like to get benefit, to share the benefit from our presence together here. So in the oil and gas sector, it's self-paid because we have a product, and if we control the fugitive gases or the emissions, we can still pay it again, and we can sell it again and get money for this. So whatever the price we are going to implement in the technology to reduce these fugitive gases, it's paid for itself. What about other sectors? What about from your own perspective? What about agriculture? What about waste? Is it self-paid? Is it a sustainable business model to adopt or not? I will turn back to you, but think about it, okay? And to my friend from Ghana, we waited for you for a long time, but it's okay. I know the traffic here is very jammed. I believe in Ghana, and today is we are celebrating the civil society. I believe in Ghana, you are addressing methane reduction from waste area and from various activity. And do you find, how do you find it first, and how you can identify the role of civil society in implementation of such target to reduce the methane emissions?
All right. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I was engaged with in another meeting, so I couldn't close early. I wanted to pick up from what my colleague on the other side mentioned about the importance of political awareness and also the political will to, I think the political awareness is very important in taking action and also bringing up policies. But they are also very entrenched barriers in implementing policies as well. So we in Ghana focus on not only creating political awareness, but also how we can remove barriers that prevent implementation of methane reduction interventions. We are not as big as the Nigerians or the Americans, so we focus on the non-fossil methane reduction interventions in livestock and also in the waste sector. And recently, we've launched our first program in the rice sector. We in Article 6. So the government of Ghana and the Switzerland government has launched a program to reduce methane in rice production through the carbon market. And it is aiming at supporting the adoption of alternate wetting and drying practices in rice farming in the country. And the aim is to support 11,000 farmers and at the same time export the carbon credits to the Swiss government for them to use to attain their NDCs, and at the same time support the local rice farmers. So we are of the view that in tackling methane, it ought to be linked with the social benefit of the people. And that is why our policies are looking at interventions in the waste sector and in the agricultural sector that touch on the very fabric of the people. And we think that is very important because then that is the only way we can really sustain the methane reduction argument on the table, because the economics alone to us doesn't make sense, right? So we ought to combine it with the social benefits in adopting measures to reduce methane in these areas. Last point is that um, in the case of the oil and gas sector, we in 2012 adopted a law that aims at either minimizing or seeking an approval before you can flare. But I mean, the full implementation of the law is also being constrained the by policy incoherences, right? And whilst we have made some gains in investing in infrastructure for gas processing and reducing flaring, there are also issues in terms of gas reinjection because of the exhaustion of the capacities of the reinjection of the gas, and therefore that is also the reason why we are experiencing some amount of gas flares in the country. So to end, in all of this, the role of private sector, the role of CSOs, very important in creating advocacy and awareness among the communities who are involved in the policy making and also implementation. And that is what we do in Ghana.
If I may ask you, did you meet any troubles specifically in reduction of methane in rice cultivation on the rice field? Because we have the same problem here in Egypt, and it's not all the rice fields are belonging to the government, so it's not large area. It's rather than a sparsely distributed area. So how do you find it?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have large rice fields, and not all the rice fields are irrigated. So we had to start from small associations who come together to form cooperatives, and then we can then provide them support in adopting the alternative wetting and drying. And these lands belong to the individuals, not the government. So the decision to adopt the water in, water out practice depends on the cooperatives. So that is what we use to get access to the cooperatives as well. Thank you.
This is a nice idea. I believe Dr. Ali will transfer it to the assigned authority.
Yeah, this is very important, and I think we can share this with our fighting every year with burning the rice through waste. But now we are turning it to a value products because we distributed already the machines to cut the rice through to the farmers so they can collect it and transfer to our products. So the business model already in Egypt is there. I mean, and we are looking for more for bigger view to start using rice straw in the production of paper or the production of other type of fertilizers or whatever. But this was a really a big problem in Egypt. Maybe the area of rice straw in Egypt is it's a big more than in Ghana, I guess, yeah. But maybe one of my comments related to the pledge to Misan and you mentioned to the sectors that we can work on. It's it is always knowing that the waste sector 20% of the methane is coming from the waste management sector. I think we are working in Egypt to close all the dump sites in 2 years. I have my colleague, Dr. Tariq, he's the head of the Waste Management Regulatory Authority. So we have the waste law right now in progress. We have working and we have the also the executive director if the role if the law is already approved, so might be one of the ideas that we to go sectorial for working on this. Maybe in oil and gas in Nigeria is another story. You are also big producer for oil in Africa. So this we can learn how this will be a shift. I still need to understand this is more how it will be implemented, especially with the very critical sectors as like oil and gas, but might be in the waste sector in Egypt because we are building our infrastructure for landfill. So maybe the collection of methane and using it could be something very interesting. So maybe the business model, I think you have more information than us, how the business model will be working in this direction. So this is my view, yeah. Tariq would like in the discussion to see more from his perspective. He will be able to do. Thank you.
My just in terms of your experience in the civil society, think about what you can suggest for implementation in a nutshell. In nutshell, because civil society likes to speak a lot.
Yes, today is a Civil Society Day. I agree with, for this role because we can work with Ministry of Environment, of course, as a civil society capacity building for NGOs working on this critical issue and the critical topics as we said, especially for the farmers and villages, and also to change behavior and thinking of how to know new technology, especially NGO. There is technical wise needed to be a capacity building as a networking, and this is to make an advocacy from alliance for just advocacy for Misan alliance from NGO clever. I think it's a clever NGO, and also to know how to make an good advocacy for this issue. Maybe it's a small projects under supervision for technicality in order to sustain. And this is maybe transfer from America or or Nigeria or whatever new technology, new trends of advocacy, new sustained platform, how to be capacity building for future. I think Egyptian civil society to be specified in each issue for climate justice and climate change and these topics mainly. We can work as one of NGOs and others, making group and by helping, of course, as a stakeholders from America or any partners stakeholders, we can do under supervision for technical expert and Ministry of Environment, of course, especially for our villages and all over Egypt. Thanks.
شكرا ماي متشكرين شكرا جزيلا. Back to Claire. I I guess you got enough time to think about how we can implement President Biden support in Egypt, how we can find it, and then we can go to Johnson.
Thanks so much. And I think this implementation question is really, really important. And it's also, it's a new era of the COP framework. You know, we are transitioning into implementation and it's one of the reasons why, you know, Together for Implementation is such an appropriate tagline for COP27. In the US, we talk about implementation plus. We need to plus up our ambition, but also prove that we can implement. In terms of the project in Egypt on oil and gas reduction, there are several agencies in the United States that focus on both technical transfer and investment. And these are the two components that we will need for sure to make sure this project is implemented. And these agencies, EXIM, DFC, USTDA, they're focused on investment and technical assistance, are standing ready to work with the Egypt Ministry of Petroleum to implement this project. And I know civil society as well is very much standing in the wings, ready to get to work. But from the U.S. side, our agencies are excited to partner with the government of Egypt on this.
I might have had too much time. No, I do want to go back to something Daniel was talking about in the barriers piece, and connected actually to your question of you were talking about how in the oil and gas sector, if you look at the cost curves, it makes you wonder why aren't we doing this already? But it connects to what Daniel was talking about is barriers. And he's absolutely right. Political will is only one element of it. You have to figure out how to then overcome the barriers that exist in the system, whether it's the waste sector or the ag sector or the oil and gas sector. there are things that are currently preventing us from moving forward on mitigating methane emissions. And some of them are quite strange. There are really bizarre stories of in Texas, we interviewed a company and they had all this natural gas at a well site that they were just wasting. And they had the ability to power equipment at the site with natural gas, but they were bringing in diesel fuel to power everything, and it was costing them thousands and thousands of dollars to bring in a truckload of diesel fuel. And we were interviewing them, and they were very candid with us. They said, well, the guy that runs the drilling platform here, his brother-in-law is a diesel salesman. And if he cuts off the diesel, then he's going to get in trouble with his sister. So there are strange things like that that exist in the system. But there's much bigger barriers. In Mexico, for example, we ran into an issue where in the oil and gas company Pemex in Mexico, Pemex gets an operating budget from the federal government. If Pemex reduces methane emissions and then they sell that gas, the profit from the sale of that gas that they conserve from going to the atmosphere, that goes to the federal government. It doesn't then trickle back down to them. So the cost curve means nothing to them. And so they never see that benefit. So there's a barrier in the system in how the money flows from the government to the company that has to be overcome so that that cost curve then starts to mean something. But there's dozens and dozens and dozens of barriers like that. In the waste sector, it's a whole nother set of barriers that you have to figure out to overcome. And they're on a much more localized level. At the oil and gas level, we're talking about federal governments, national oil companies, international oil companies. But on the waste side, we're talking about barriers that exist at the municipal level, at the village and the city level, at the personal level. How you dispose of your waste is something that is a very personal thing that you have to overcome that barrier in order to be able to get to the methane emissions. So yes, a lot of this stuff is cost effective. A lot of this stuff is profitable, but it requires policy and political will to overcome those the barriers that exist in the system to be able to realize that. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jonathan. At the end, I just would like to wrap up. We went through our experience with African brothers, specifically in Nigeria, about what they did for implementation of the first methane law, and also from Ghana about involvement of the civil society sector in waste management. And I believe both of Ghana and Nigeria, we can get benefit from their experiments or from their experience in Egypt, because we are having the same activities, specifically with the ambitious plan from Ministry of Environment to control the waste sector and establishment of all the waste recycling factories, and even collecting all of methane rather than flare it to the atmosphere. And also we have the ambitious plan from the Ministry of Petroleum and Ministry of Electricity. And by taking out or eliminating all the barriers, and we have some common goal to achieve it, I believe it's achievable. Maybe not in the near future term, but it will be at the end we can reach there. And I thank Jonathan for this fruitful and straight to the point identification of the problem of methane reduction, how we can implement it away from the barriers. Thank you, Claire, for your inspiring talk about it's achievable. Yeah, I know. And thanks, Dr. Ali, for your time and being with us. And we may conclude it, and we will send to you the live streaming for future as a reference. Thank you so much. ممكن ناخد صورة؟